When you walk into a major railway station built during the 1800s, you're often struck by something difficult to name. The space feels too grand, too precise, too confident for buildings that supposedly went up in the midst of rapid industrialization. These aren't the rough-hewn structures of a society learning new techniques. They're finished masterworks that appeared within a remarkably compressed timeframe across multiple continents. For this examination, I've looked through publicly accessible photographs from institutional archives, architectural surveys published in period journals, construction records where they exist, city planning documents, newspaper reports from the 1800s, and comparative measurements taken from multiple sources. I've also reviewed what mainstream historians and architectural scholars have written about these buildings, along with what engineers today say about their construction. What follows isn't an attempt to prove any single explanation. It's an effort to look carefully at what can be documented and measured, to acknowledge where the conventional historical narrative provides answers, and to identify where questions persist. Some of what we'll discuss comes down to verifiable numbers: the span of an iron framework, the tonnage of materials used, the number of workers listed in a ledger. Other aspects involve interpretation, and I'll be clear about which is which. The stations we're examining share certain characteristics. They were built roughly between 1850 and 1910. They employ similar engineering solutions despite being separated by thousands of miles, and they demonstrate a level of architectural sophistication that raises questions about the timeline and resources attributed to their construction. Whether those questions have satisfactory answers is something we'll explore together. I'm not asking you to accept any particular conclusion, only to look at what exists and consider what it might mean. St. Pancras Station in London provides a useful starting point. The train shed, completed in 1868, spans 243 feet without intermediate support columns. That single-span iron arch was the widest in the world at the time. The structure rises 100 feet at its apex. William Henry Barlow designed it, and the Butterley Company fabricated the ironwork. According to records, construction took approximately 2 years. The accompanying hotel building, designed by George Gilbert Scott, contains ornate Gothic Revival elements: pointed arches, detailed stonework, intricate carvings that required skilled masons working from complex plans. Grand Central Terminal in New York, completed in its present form in 1913, covers 48 acres. The main concourse measures 275 feet long, 120 feet wide, and 125 feet high. The windows alone required careful engineering to support their weight, while allowing maximum light penetration. The station was built while trains continued operating on the site, which meant construction crews had to work around active rail traffic. The acoustic properties of the space: you can whisper at one corner and be heard clearly at the diagonal opposite corner, suggest deliberate design rather than happy accident. Milano Centrale in Italy wasn't completed until 1931, but its design process began in 1906, and the scale of the original plans reflects turn-of-the-century ambitions. The building reaches a height of 236 feet. The facade stretches 656 feet and incorporates Art Nouveau and Art Deco elements alongside classical references. The main waiting room features a vaulted ceiling with steel ribs covered in decorated plaster. The complexity of coordinating multiple architectural styles into a cohesive structure represents significant planning. Leipzig Hauptbahnhof in Germany, finished in 1915, holds the distinction of being one of the largest railway stations by floor area. It contains 26 platforms under a series of arched iron and glass roofs. Each arch was fabricated off-site, transported, and assembled with precision that allowed them to fit together without gaps. The station was designed to serve 2 separate railway companies simultaneously, which meant duplicate facilities running parallel to each other, a logistical challenge that required exact measurements and planning. These dimensions matter because they represent engineering challenges. A 243-foot span means calculating the exact curve needed to distribute weight properly. It means understanding how iron behaves under different temperatures, how much each piece will expand or contract. It means fabricating components that will align correctly when assembled. The margin for error decreases as the span increases. The materials themselves are worth examining. Wrought iron and cast iron have different properties. Wrought iron handles tension better, cast iron handles compression. The Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, demonstrated that prefabricated iron components could be manufactured, transported, and assembled into large structures. That was 1851. By 1868, St. Pancras was complete. The progression from experimental structure to masterwork happened within 17 years. Period records indicate that the Butterley Company employed approximately 600 workers in their ironworks. These workers would have been producing materials for multiple projects simultaneously. The timeline suggests they fabricated the St. Pancras components, while also fulfilling other contracts. How the work was distributed, how quality control was maintained across hundreds of individual pieces, and how the assembly sequence was coordinated all point to sophisticated project management. The glass used in these structures wasn't simple window glass. The panels needed to be large enough to allow light penetration but strong enough to withstand wind loads and their own weight when installed at angles. They required frames that would hold them securely while allowing for thermal expansion. The technology existed. This isn't a question of impossible materials. The question is about the speed of implementation and the consistency of results across multiple projects happening simultaneously in different countries. Construction photographs from the period do exist for some stations. They show wooden scaffolding, workers positioning iron components, cranes lifting materials into place. What's often absent is documentation of the intermediate stages. We have images of stations under construction and images of completed stations, but detailed photographic records of the day-to-day progress are less common. This isn't unusual, for the period photography was expensive and time-consuming, but it does mean we have fewer reference points for understanding exactly how the work proceeded. Newspapers from the 1860s through 1910s covered major station construction as civic events. They reported on opening ceremonies, described architectural features, sometimes mentioned cost overruns or delays. What they typically didn't provide was technical detail about construction methods or worker conditions. When labor disputes occurred, they might be mentioned, but the coverage focused on economic impact rather than the nature of the work being performed. The conventional historical explanation points to the Industrial Revolution as the enabling factor. Advances in iron production made large quantities of standardized materials available. The spread of railway networks created economic incentive for impressive stations. Architectural education had become more formalized, producing engineers and architects trained in mathematics and structural principles. The growth of cities provided both labor pools and markets that justified major infrastructure investment. This explanation accounts for much of what we observe. It explains why these stations appeared when they did rather than earlier. It explains why they cluster in industrialized nations. It explains why railway companies would invest in grand architecture. Stations were public faces of their enterprises, and impressive buildings suggested stability and progress. What it addresses less completely is the simultaneous emergence of sophisticated solutions across wide geographic areas. Leipzig and Grand Central weren't built by the same firms or even in the same countries, yet both solved similar engineering problems in comparable ways. The transfer of technical knowledge in the late 1800s happened through published journals, international exhibitions, and professional networks. Engineers and architects did travel and share information. But the speed at which complex techniques appeared in multiple locations suggests either very rapid knowledge transfer or parallel development based on shared principles. There's also the question of predecessor structures. Typically, architectural and engineering advances show progression: simpler versions built first, lessons learned, then more ambitious projects undertaken. The Crystal Palace demonstrated prefabrication. The Palm House at Kew Gardens, completed in 1848, showed that curved iron and glass structures were feasible. These were important precedents. But between these relatively modest structures and the massive railway stations, the intermediate steps are less visible in the architectural record. It's not that they don't exist, but they're fewer than you might expect. Another aspect that invites examination is how accurately these stations anticipated future needs. Many were built larger than immediate requirements justified. St. Pancras could have been smaller in 1868 and still handled the traffic of that era. The same applies to Grand Central and others. One explanation is that planners correctly forecast growth in rail travel. Another is that the buildings served purposes beyond pure functionality, they were statements of civic pride and corporate power. A third possibility, though less commonly discussed, is that the spaces were designed to accommodate uses we can't fully reconstruct from the historical record. The acoustic properties of spaces like Grand Central's main concourse suggest intentional design. The whispering gallery effect doesn't happen by accident in a room that size. It requires specific proportions and surface materials. Whether this was explicitly planned or discovered after construction isn't entirely clear from available documentation. If it was planned, it demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how sound behaves in large enclosed spaces. If it was discovered afterward, it suggests the designers achieved something they weren't consciously attempting, which raises questions about what principles they were following. Ventilation systems in these stations also demonstrate careful thought. Before mechanical ventilation became common, buildings relied on natural airflow. The high ceilings and strategic window placement in major stations created convection currents that moved air through the spaces. Smoke from coal-burning locomotives needed to be evacuated, passengers needed fresh air, and the systems needed to function in different weather conditions. The solutions varied by station but consistently showed an understanding of air movement principles. Load-bearing calculations for these structures would have required precise mathematics. The weight of the iron framework, the glass panels, accumulated snow and wind forces, all of these had to be accounted for. The fact that these stations are still standing more than a century later indicates the calculations were accurate. Modern structural engineers who have examined these buildings note that the safety margins were often quite tight by contemporary standards, suggesting the designers knew exactly how much strength they needed and didn't over-engineer unnecessarily. When you examine architectural history, you generally find a pattern. Techniques develop gradually, with each generation building on what came before. Stone masons improved their methods over centuries. Cathedral builders learned from earlier failures. Collapsed vaults taught them about load distribution, cracked walls taught them about foundation depth. The progression is visible if you look at structures chronologically. Early examples show experimentation and occasional miscalculation. Later examples show refinement and confidence. With 19th-century railway stations, this progression is less apparent. The early stations don't look like rough drafts. The buildings that came before these major terminals were typically much simpler structures, small station houses with basic platform covers. Then, within a relatively brief period, you have Street Pancras, Grand Central, the Gare d'Orsay in Paris, and dozens of others demonstrating similar levels of sophistication. The leap from simple platform shelters to vast iron and glass cathedrals happened quickly. You can look at other building types from the same period for comparison. Office buildings grew gradually taller as elevator technology improved and steel frame construction developed. The progression from 5-story buildings to 10-story buildings to early skyscrapers shows clear stages. Bridges similarly show evolution. Suspension bridges grew longer span by span as engineers tested materials and refined their calculations. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, was significantly more ambitious than earlier suspension bridges, but you can trace the development of suspension bridge technology through earlier, smaller examples. Railway stations present a different pattern. The major terminals appear without an extensive series of smaller experimental versions. There were certainly modest stations built throughout the railway expansion, but they don't show the same engineering ambition. It's as though two separate building traditions existed simultaneously: practical, utilitarian stations for smaller towns, and monumental structures for major cities. The gap between these two categories is substantial. Labor records from the construction period exist, though they're not always complete. For some stations, we have payroll information indicating how many workers were employed and what trades they represented. Masons, ironworkers, carpenters, laborers, the categories are documented. What's less available is detailed information about training and skill development. Where did the workers learn to handle these specific materials and techniques? Some would have come through traditional apprenticeship systems, but those systems typically emphasized experience over years, not rapid skill acquisition for new technologies. Newspaper coverage from construction periods tends to focus on milestones, groundbreaking ceremonies, structural completions, opening days. The Manchester Guardian, the Times of London, the New York Times, and other major papers covered these events. What you find less often are accounts of the daily work, the challenges encountered, the solutions improvised on site. When problems did occur, budget overruns, construction delays, accidents, they were sometimes reported, but the technical details were usually omitted. The coverage assumed readers cared about outcomes, not processes. One notable example is the construction of the original Pennsylvania station in New York, completed in 1910 and tragically demolished in 1963. Contemporary accounts describe the excavation work, mention the thousands of workers involved, note the use of pink granite from Massachusetts. What they don't extensively document is how the coordination between different construction trades was managed, how the materials were sequenced, how quality control was maintained across such a large site. We know these things were done, the building was completed successfully, but the documentation of methodology is limited. Photographic records vary significantly from one station to another. Some projects were extensively photographed, with images showing different construction stages. Others have far fewer images. The photographs that do exist show recognizable construction techniques, scaffolding, cranes, workers positioning materials. What they don't always show is the preparatory work, the foundation construction, the fabrication of components before they arrived on site. This isn't because such work didn't happen, but because it wasn't always considered worth documenting visually. Comparing the documentation practices for railway stations with those for other major projects of the era reveals some interesting patterns. The construction of the Suez Canal, completed in 1869, was extensively documented with reports, photographs, and detailed accounts of the engineering challenges. The Brooklyn Bridge construction, from 1869 to 1883, generated substantial documentation including technical papers, progress reports, and photography. Major railway stations received attention, but the documentation was often less technical and more focused on architectural appreciation. The functional design of these stations sometimes appears to anticipate needs beyond what the immediate circumstances required. Platform lengths at many major terminals exceeded what was necessary for the longest trains operating when the stations opened. Waiting areas could accommodate more passengers than typically passed through during peak hours. One explanation is that railway companies and city planners expected growth and built accordingly. This was prudent planning, and it proved accurate. Many of these stations did eventually need all the capacity that was originally provided. However, some aspects of the design suggest considerations beyond simple capacity planning. The proportions of spaces, the relationship between ceiling heights and floor areas, the placement of natural light sources, these elements show attention to how humans experience large architectural volumes. Whether this came from formal architectural theory, from inherited building traditions, or from practical experimentation isn't always clear from the available records. Modern engineers who study historical structures sometimes find solutions they wouldn't have expected. The iron framework in many stations uses connection methods that distribute stress in sophisticated ways. Some joints allow for thermal expansion without creating stress points. Others transfer loads through multiple paths, providing redundancy. These aren't simple designs, and they suggest either advanced calculation methods or extensive practical knowledge that wasn't fully documented in writing. Cross-cultural similarities in station design raise questions about how architectural ideas moved between countries. International exhibitions like the Great Exhibition of 1851 and the various World's Fairs provided venues where engineers and architects could see new technologies and designs. Professional journals published in multiple languages allowed ideas to circulate. Individuals traveled for business and study, bringing knowledge back to their home countries. These mechanisms existed and functioned. What's notable is how quickly certain design solutions appeared across different contexts. The arch iron and glass roof became a standard element at major stations in England, France, Germany, Italy, and the United States within a few decades. Each implementation had local variations, but the basic concept spread rapidly. This could indicate that the solution was sufficiently obvious once the materials became available that multiple designers independently arrived at similar conclusions. It could also suggest more direct knowledge transfer than is fully documented in the historical record. The standardization of certain elements also appears quickly. Rail gauges varied between countries and even between different railway companies, but architectural solutions showed remarkable consistency. The use of wrought iron for certain structural elements, cast iron for others, the proportions of arch spans, the integration of glass panels, these became standard practices without an obvious central authority dictating them. Professional consensus emerged through some combination of published work, observed examples, and shared training, but the speed of this consensus is noteworthy. When you look at stations built in different countries during overlapping time periods, you sometimes find solutions to problems that haven't been extensively discussed in surviving technical literature. The way that some stations handled the transition between different roof levels, the methods used to waterproof glass iron joints, the techniques for anchoring large structures to varying soil conditions, these practical solutions appear in multiple locations without always being explained in contemporary engineering texts. One way to interpret this is that practical knowledge among builders and engineers exceeded what was written down. Craftsmen often worked from experience and observation rather than written specifications. Skills were demonstrated and taught directly. This was common in construction trades. The limitation is that it makes it harder for us to understand exactly how certain things were accomplished, because the documentation focused on results rather than methods. Another perspective considers whether the timeline of construction matches what the physical evidence suggests. Buildings accumulate weathering patterns, materials age in predictable ways, and forensic analysis can sometimes reveal information about construction sequence. Most major stations have undergone renovations and repairs that complicate this kind of analysis, but when original materials remain accessible, they can provide data points. Studies that have been conducted generally confirm the stated construction dates, though comprehensive forensic analysis of all major 19th century stations hasn't been undertaken. There's also the question of whether these buildings might have served different functions before becoming railway stations, or whether they incorporated elements from earlier structures. This has been proposed as an explanation for their sophistication, though the evidence for it varies. Most major stations have relatively clear documentation of their construction from the ground up. Property records, planning documents, and contemporary accounts describe new construction rather than adaptation of existing buildings. That doesn't preclude the possibility that some elements were reused or that earlier structures on the same sites influenced later designs, but it does make wholesale repurposing unlikely for most of the major examples. What remains genuinely difficult to explain from the available documentation is the compressed time frame. The period from roughly 1850 to 1910 saw the construction of dozens of major railway terminals across multiple continents, each requiring significant resources, skilled labor, and engineering expertise. This happened during a period of general infrastructure expansion. Cities were growing, factories were being built, bridges and roads were under construction. The labor pool and material resources were being drawn upon for many simultaneous projects. How this was all coordinated, how sufficient skilled workers were available for so many demanding projects at once, isn't fully addressed in the historical literature. Some researchers have suggested that the scale of these projects indicates a level of social organization and resource mobilization that isn't completely reflected in how we typically understand the period. Others point to the economic boom conditions of the late 1800s and early 1900s as providing the necessary resources. Both perspectives have supporting evidence, and they aren't mutually exclusive. What's worth considering is that our understanding of any historical period is based on incomplete documentation, and there may be aspects of 19th century construction practice that weren't fully recorded. What we've examined here comes down to a series of observations and questions. The physical structures exist, you can visit them, measure them, walk through them. The historical record provides dates, names, and documented accounts of their construction. The engineering principles they employ can be analyzed and understood by contemporary experts. All of this is verifiable and documented. At the same time, certain aspects invite further examination. The rapid appearance of sophisticated solutions across wide geographic areas, the consistency of design elements despite varying local conditions, the compressed construction timelines relative to the scale and complexity of the projects, and the gaps in documentation about methodology and daily construction processes all raise questions about how completely we understand what happened during this period. This doesn't require accepting any particular alternative explanation. It simply means acknowledging that the conventional historical narrative, while providing a useful framework, doesn't address every observable detail. The absence of certain documentation doesn't prove anything was hidden or suppressed. Records are lost. Priorities change regarding what's worth preserving, and practical knowledge often goes undocumented. But the absences are worth noting. For anyone interested in exploring these questions further, the primary sources are accessible. Architectural archives hold original plans and construction documents. Institutional photograph collections contain images from the period. Period newspapers are available through library databases. The buildings themselves can be visited and observed directly. The invitation here isn't to accept a predetermined conclusion but to look carefully at what exists, compare it with what the historical record says, and consider what questions remain open. These structures have stood for over a century. They continue to function, to serve the purposes they were ostensibly built for. They represent significant achievements regardless of how we understand their construction. What they might additionally represent, what other stories they might contain, remains a matter for ongoing consideration and research.